Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. It's just myself today. Amanda, she had some other commitments for the day, and so it's me riding solo today. And we had to reschedule our guest from last week, Rekha Chaudhry. So stay tuned. She's going to be coming back probably next month sometime. But with her, we're going to be talking about the impact of healthy choices on our cancer risk. So what we can do to reduce that level of risk. So to jump in so this week, we welcome back. So another returning guest of ours. We covered with Markerra. We talked about women in transitional spaces last time she was with us. And this time we're going to build off of her last episode, and we're going to talk about the fear of rejection and how that kind of holds us back from stepping into our power, and I'm sure how that comes in, for women in navigating transitional spaces. So thank you for coming back, and thanks for joining again with us, Markerra.
Thank you guys for having me. Good to be back.
So if people want to find you, and we'll talk about that at the end. I think I copied over our notes from last time, and we'll put those back in the show notes. But Markerra Larkin is coming back with us. So that way, if anybody needs to find you, they have your last name too.
Look, that works for me. Find me on Instagram.
Yeah. Okay. So if you don't mind, if people didn't catch your original episode with us, can you give us just a brief introduction, kind of your journey up until this point, and why you've brought this topic and, well, the combination of these two topics to our podcast?
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Markerra Larkin. I'm currently an associate counselor with Port Counseling based out of Norcross, Georgia. I primarily work with individuals, specifically women, who are dealing with transitions. So that looks like co-parenting, learning how to parent, re-entering the dating scene after divorce. Or just, learning how to navigate these difficult spaces that you may find yourself in. So I deal with a lot of clients who struggle with, high performance, anxiety, the perfectionism. I couldn't even talk. Perfectionism, and a host of things. I know last time I was here, we talked about transitional spaces and what does that look like, and even how to learning how to like redefine transition for you, right, to make it personal. And so when we talk about the fear of rejection, especially when we're talking about transition, it can be really hard to enter into those new spaces because it's a fear of like, am I going to belong here? Did I earn the right to be in this space? And in the work that I'm doing with these individuals, I am finding that that is the biggest question is, do I belong in this space? So I'm very glad to be back to talk a little bit more about, not just the transitional space, but what does that look like when we're talking about the fear of rejection?
Yes, yes, yes. And I feel like today's topic is something that is so big that we could go so many directions with it. So I like tying it into the women in transitional spaces, probably to keep us narrow. But what in your work with clients, and I know we're both in the field, so in the populations you work with, how do you, I guess, how do you start to target that's like a thing for your client? Do you start to pick up on things? Is there like, how soon or how early on do you start to see that fear of rejection kind of coming into play?
Ooh, that's interesting. You say that. That question. So with some clients, I get to see it early on, and it's in the language. It's negative self-talk. I hear a lot of especially when we start talking about like parents or just environment in general. I hear quite a bit of like negative self-talk when it comes to being able to accomplish certain things, or again, the sense of belonging in certain spaces. So a lot of my high performing clients will say that they have anxiety when they go into these meetings with, kind of like the higher ups. Might be some senior level management. You may even be meeting with the CEO. And so their language changes from being confident, especially when we're talking about overcoming certain things. And I work with a lot of women of color, And I have noticed that that's been a big thing, the sense of belonging. So I usually hear it in language. Sometimes it shows up later when we start talking about, if a client is only wanting to focus on like what they're currently experiencing right now. But later on, when we talk about background and we talk about family, we talk about relationships, then the language changes. Again, it goes back to that sense of like, do I belong in this relationship? Or I had a terrible relationship with my parents, and I don't know how to forgive myself, for feeling a certain type of way about my parents. So again, it just shows up in the language.
Yeah.
Sometimes early on, sometimes depending on the topic.
I completely agree. Because as you were talking about, your population and the ways that you hear that come up, I do a lot. So a lot of my practice, I kind of specialize in working with individuals who have experienced developmental trauma, aka attachment trauma, with primary caregivers, and it's a very I love like seeing those moments for clients, like whenever, because like it's such a therapist thing to say, like so many things do come back to childhood, unfortunately. So like whenever we're talking about like, okay, how did your parents make you feel loved, or did your parents make you feel loved and respected and heard, and did you have a say, were your needs met? And then when they're like, yeah, not really. Or maybe there was abuse, or everybody's story looks different. But then how that infiltrates how we show up in the world. And I always say perspective is reality. So
Right.
those needs that I didn't get met will then kind of become filters for how I'm, perceiving the world, and then how I'm showing up in the world. So if I always felt rejected, I kind of come from a place of believing that right off the bat. So, and we don't realize it until we have anybody, to help us step outside of it and be like, oh, I was going into this already believing that it was going to go the worst. I was going to be rejected. I was not going to be loved. I wasn't going to feel like I belonged at all.
And that's so good that you say that, because so often one of the things that I wish we would talk about more of is like being able to own those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to own the fact that you are having a tough time seeing yourself in a more positive light, or that you feel like you're kind of living in the shadows of, whatever was kind of imposed on you. So especially when we talk about, growing up, like what did you hear,
Yeah.
and that you about yourself that you started to believe. And I think what tends to happen, even when you were talking about attachment, is that it just shows up in different ways. You could be doing something for so long and wondering like, man, where am I getting this from? And it might not necessarily have been anything that you learned, but it might have been a response to something you've learned. So again, if it's that constant feeling of like, man, I need to be perfect, I have to do it this way, I can only be accepted in this way, then it kind of shows up in other ways, and you just take on a different personality. Another thing too, when we talk about the fear of rejection, it just really, it really creates this idea of that you can only be one dimensional,
Mm-hmm.
like you just have to show up as this person in this space or in any space. So you kind of lose a sense of your own identity.
Yes, it's like, how do I? Because when I ask that question, and I do, and this has probably come up, and because they're so foundational, so it comes up probably almost every episode. But I do a ton of work with my clients in the very early beginning stages with everybody, like, and on our core values, right? And sometimes it's like, it sounds like a topic that gets blown off, and it's like, well, of course I value somebody respecting me. Sorry, my dog sounds like a miniature horse.
It's
I guess,
fine.
sir. He's like, but of course, I value being respected, or I value people being honest with me, or I can say those things, but sitting down and taking inventory of what are my core values, how or are these different from the things that were modeled or ingrained or responded into me, basically. And then I take it a step further with people, and I'm like, okay, if these are your core values, and then I make them break that up into what are values that you are that you believe you're actively living by right now? And then what are the values that you would like to be living more by? And then that can help us say like, oh, and very often the fear of rejection, or I see like a fear of failure, or, you know, but for today's topic, a fear of rejection. It's like, yeah, I'm not living by maybe certain professional values or personal life values because of that huge, huge fear that if I lean into that vulnerability and if I would live by that, that likelihood or belief that I'm going to be rejected just keeps me from aligning those two paths for myself.
I think too, even with you saying that, I think too, even with the work that we get to do with clients, well, I'll say some of the things that I definitely have seen, you probably have too, is that it's hard to acknowledge when you were not good to yourself.
Oh, yes.
And when you actually thought you were really being spot on and really taking care of yourself and really not walking in a certain mindset or living out those core values that you were just talking about, that's really hard to come to terms with for a lot of clients. And I think in my opinion, I think that it's so hard because now you have to change the narrative. If this whole idea of rejection was embedded based on this experience that you had with a parent, a friend, or just the environment, and then once you actually sit down and start to unpack and look at the ways in which you mistreated yourself, that's very hard to come to terms with, because then the narrative is not, well, I'm this way because you made me this way. It's, I really did those things. I mistreated myself, and in that moment, being able to acknowledge, like, wow, how did this, impact the way that I allowed others to treat me?
I
You
love
know,
that so much because my brain immediately goes to kind of us being compassionate towards ourselves. Like I felt that going right there, but like my brain instantly was like being compassionate towards ourselves and saying like that narrative or those behaviors or those ways of treating myself, they they didn't form overnight and they served a purpose at one time, unfortunately, right? They were getting needs met for me
yeah.
at the time. And now it's like, then, like you were saying, we have to come to the place where I need to flip the script on myself, but in a very graceful, compassionate way.
Yeah.
And it's so scary. It's like we're releasing things that, like, we kind of formed into our identity. Like for myself and my own therapy, like self disclosure, but like I'm very much, had this part of myself that was always very overly controlled and like very critical and like everybody likes to call it type A. Uh and for me, I didn't realize how much of that was I was like being very, very mean to myself. And that's so hard to like sit with and be like, yeah, I was perpetuating that, wasn't I? And then how do I do kind of the opposite action stuff?
Listen, I think some of the best therapists are those who have therapists.
Maybe.
Um,
Huh.
I have one myself, and that is literally like when you were talking about, you're describing that type A personality. I was like, yep, that's me. Like, even being able to sit in that space to acknowledge, like, wow, I did these things because, like you just mentioned, they did serve a purpose.
Right.
And I know when we talk about even changing the mindset or changing the narrative, there can be some fear that comes in there, because it's like, well, wait a minute. If I'm not the quote unquote victim, or if I'm not the bad guy, right? Then how do I change this narrative? And what things do I put in place to kind of really nurture this new space I'm in? So I think even, just going into being able to again recognize, like, man, okay, this is an opportunity versus, dang, I really did that. That the language matters so much in our profession is surrounded by language and the changing of language and just how it impacts our mindset.
I always, the grace, the compassion, and saying too, like it's okay because my brain ties that into the fear of rejection because I think there can be a fear of being rejected by people if I do start to change these things about myself. It's like we think as humans that we are, responsible and, in control, or we need to be in control of how other people perceive us. And it's like if I go start, changing the narrative and I start changing how I show up, is that going to like leave me alone, or are people going to, it's hard to, we feel like we need to be able to change the perception that other people have or live up to the way that
Yeah.
people already have been perceiving us. And that's scary, just a whole separate thing, that fear of being rejected if we do change these things for ourselves.
Yes, that is so good. All of that. Yes to all of that. I want to piggyback off of that as well. Even teaching clients to like go into that space of asking yourself, how have other people benefited from who you were?
Yes.
Like, how do they benefit from the fear? How do they benefit from the imposter syndrome? How do they benefit from your need to have that sense of belonging in a certain space?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you benefit? What were some things that were transactional in that relationship? So, okay, you showed up as this perfect individual, no flaws, or however, whatever. And the benefit was nobody questioned you about anything. And what I tell my clients is like, think about it. If something looks good, you don't question, quote unquote, good, right? If
Mm-hmm.
the food is good, nobody's questioning, like, "Oh, how could this be made to taste bad?"
Right. Right. Yeah.
No, nobody's questioning anything. And I think sometimes we really do get caught up in that. Okay, how can I make this look a certain way so that no one really sees who I am? Or on the flip side of things, so that I don't really have to dig deeper in and do the work and change the narrative.
Yes, that avoidance. And 'cause I do a lot of schema therapy, internal
Mm,
and a lot of schema work with clients, and that brought me to like those coping styles, right? How do I what falls into my realm here, the things that I need to step into and take responsibility for myself, because nobody's going to uproot and shift and restructure these things for myself but me. Am I avoiding the things that would trigger these really uncomfortable feelings? Am I just surrendering to them because I just believe them as reality? So I just,
mm,
that's exactly how I move through the world. I just surrender to it. Or am I overcompensating? Am I, showing up and being maybe overcritical of other people? Or, am I making myself smaller and to kind of maintain the status quo, to just not have to deal with it?
I think it's easy to go into those hiding spaces.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's easy to go into those spaces of, okay, well, what happens if I don't do anything? And not working looks really appealing because again, you don't have to change anything. And the old you or the current you, however you want to term it, is accepted. And you have evidence. That was this point I was waiting to get to as well. A lot of times our experience is based on prior experience.
Oh, yeah.
It becomes evidence. It becomes that baseline of how should I interact with individuals or how should I interact with my environment. Well, I have evidence that what I was doing or what I am doing is currently working. I don't have evidence that this new me or this different mindset or narrative is going to work,
Yeah.
or help me become more comfortable in this space.
Yeah.
So I think it's so easy to go into those hiding spaces and not do the work.
Yeah.
But, in our work, we see it's costly. It can be costly.
It's costly. It's so scary. It's vulnerable, and super common to like go through and kind of clean out these things, or like I was saying earlier, restructure them, heal them, and then we feel like I hear so often kind of that feeling of like, who am I without
Right.
these things, right? And that's so scary. And then it can be like, if I don't know who I am without those things, it's like could start to feel like we're floating. And that's why I like to do that foundational other, type of work, the values and all of that good stuff. But yeah, it's like, who am I without these things that I've been clinging on to out of a fear of being rejected otherwise?
Yes, yes. And that space, it can be tough to come out of because again, like you were just saying, it provided so much comfort. It provided an escape, just from, again, not just doing the work, but having to kind of face the brave new world that you're creating. And that's something that, even in working with the clients that I work with, especially with, women who are coming into their own,
Mhm.
they're unlearning a lot of unhealthy habits that were maybe imposed or they learned just based on the environment. And so that's something else that I'm seeing as well, is that fear of like, well, wait a minute, what do I do with all these new tools? I even had a client describe this space to me as, I feel like I'm in this big empty space, but I have a bunch of tools around me. I don't know which one to pick first.
Yeah.
I thought that was so powerful because I'm like, dang, being in that space of like, even when she said empty, I'm like, oh, okay. So I can understand you've unlearned some things, some unlearning some defensive mechanisms that were put in as like preventative measures,
Mm.
but they were really, just to provide a defense so
Yes.
that no one could come in and and it allowed you to not really have to do anything different,
Yeah.
but to be in this space and not feel rushed as well, to kind of have it all together.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've seen that with some of your clients when they're coming into that new space, but a lot of the individuals that I work with, like they automatically assume like, oh, got to do something different. And it's like,
Mhm.
you don't have to rush to
No.
get it right.
No. Yeah. That's why I like to use that kind of the affirmation or just that validation as far as like those things didn't form overnight. So we're not just going to go in and, just do a complete, overhaul overnight, either. And I think not only do we feel like we're in a space of like emptiness, like internally, but then also a lot of our relationships externally
Yeah.
have been
Mm,
on these, you know, beliefs and schemas and all of the things, all of these fears that I've been kind of clinging on to. So then I do honestly start to see my relationships in my life changing, or I've had that feeling of like, I'm gonna get you before you get me. Or I think I heard you say some of that, like, I'm going to keep doing these things so that way I can keep people from getting close. So I don't have to be rejected, or I don't have to, you know, worry about being hurt. It's like we're keeping ourselves very lonely and isolated, externally too.
yeah, that's such a very good point. One of the things that I learned in my own sessions, um, it's important to recognize when you're trying to kind of create a space to bypass rejection,
Mm-hmm.
and even acknowledging like, okay, I am trying to work around this, and I think even actually going through the process of allowing yourself to feel whatever comes up when things don't exactly go your way, or when there's a different level of, or not a different level, but there's no level of reciprocity, being able to sit and process those feelings. And I think when we talk about being a perfectionist or exhibiting some kind of controlling behaviors, it really allows us not to feel anything. And so I think, and this is something I teach with my clients as well, is like, listen, what happens when you slow down? Like, what is that thing that you're trying to avoid feeling? Yes, you feel rejected, but what are some other things? Those secondary emotions, like what are some other things that are coming up for you as well? So, yes, you're saying you feel rejected, but from the rejection, do you feel hurt? Do you feel disappointed? Are you linking this back to, do you have a flashback about a certain experience or environment? And really being able to link how all of those things just shape who we are and how it really can make an impact on the way that we process things,
Yes.
even when it comes to language.
Yes, the language and when you teach well, any human, we always like, but in my practice, I can only kind of speak from that. And uh, But when you see them grasp like the concept that it's not the relationship or the person or the thing or the place that I'm avoiding, right? Like I'm avoiding how the person, the place, or the thing makes me feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not this terrible, awful, rude, cold-hearted person. And I'm like,
Right.
no, 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 we're not actually. And they're like, huh, well then.
Yep.
Uh,
It changes the narrative. It goes back to the narrative. There are so many individuals that will not tell their story. And I believe it's for one of two reasons. They don't want to make the other parties look like the villain, or
right.
they don't want to, or they may have a hard time to see where they might have been villainizing themselves, whether it was on purpose, like intended, or again, even those imposed beliefs. And so I have worked with a few clients that will not talk about family. They will not talk about any past traumas and, just how that has shown up in their relationships. And I understand that because again, it can be very hard to open up that box and really take a look at what's inside and really see, like, how did you play a part in, the individual you are today? Or how did your parents or your grandparents or your friends or just again environment, because environment matters. And I
Yep.
think that's something that, even when we come into sessions with clients, even being able to get them to the point of feeling comfortable enough to explore environment,
Mhm.
that can be a process in itself.
Yes, we are. Do you have a social work background? Are
I
you
don't.
but in our and I'm you do the same exact work, but like it's ingrained in us in the social work training of saying like we are we don't live in a vacuum. Like we're walking systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at human beings and we're saying like, yeah, you need this stuff that is, leaking out, manifesting in our day-to-day life. That didn't happen, you know, just within ourselves. Our environment matters, our upbringing matters. There's the generational trauma and patterns and being a minority or facing, adversities in our life, like so many things. And then when you were mentioning the kind of running two thoughts together, but my brain is going very quickly because I love this topic so much. But that feeling of like, if I talk about my family or if I share my story, that's a very vulnerable thing to do. I don't want to talk about other people because I love them, or I don't want to share my story because it's going to validate all of these awful things that I believe about myself if I say it out loud. And that's when I say, like, two things can be true and exist at the same time.
Right.
I can love my parents, my grandparents, my caregivers, my friends. I can love them with every fiber of my being and also acknowledge and validate the fact that I'm also hurt and that they also hurt me. Or I was doing these things, to myself, but I can also show myself love and compassion and all of those things too at the same time. And that's hard, but
Yeah.
it's
And even hearing you saying that out loud, I can understand like how the mind would try to process,
oh,
like being able to do two things at once.
oh yes.
Again, especially when you're working with clients that have that all or nothing thinking,
Mhm.
because it kind of helps them form that gray space.
Yeah.
And I can sometimes see it's an automatic withdrawal because it's like, whoa, I don't have the tools to get me out of whatever's going to come up. So I'm not going to go there. I
Right.
see that so much. And again, like you were talking about earlier, being able to validate that space that they're in, but also being able to kind of help them navigate through that space and knowing and validating those feelings of like, listen, you can be hurting and healing at the same time.
Yes.
You don't have to wait to celebrate accomplishments or anything until you reach the mountaintop.
Right.
Just being able to take those steps
Mhm.
And what I like to tell clients is that there are no big or little wins. A win is however you define it.
Mhm.
But again, I think it's easy to kind of categorize things. Just so it, the point, yeah, being able to categorize certain things, and that goes back into that all or nothing thinking of like, oh, I either have to be this way or be that way, but I can't get in that gray space. I
It's
don't
not
know what's
safe there, right? Yeah, it's not safe
yeah,
there. I feel very exposed there because if I can stand behind a certain place on that binary or that narrative, I know what to expect there. I know how to show up there. I know that I what things I can maintain to not be rejected there. But if I'm in between or if I am in that gray space, it's like way too many things feel out of our control there.
yes. And who doesn't like to have control, right? Or this idea of control. And that's again, that's what we teach our clients. W- I'm very big on like defining terms. So, something that I'll do is I'll have clients to define control by Webster. And then, we'll create like a working definition of like, well, okay, let's translate this over to your life. What does control mean to you? How does it show up? So, being able to kind of walk them through that process of not just defining things, but what does it look like to redefine this space?
I
You
love
know, yeah, so it's different, and that's something else to teach is like how can rejection be viewed in a positive light? When my therapist asked me that, I was like, "What? You're
your
joking."
chiropractor did something like voodoo magic to me the other day. I was like, came in, I was super stressed out, holding all kinds of stuff in my in my body because we know that's how that works. And he's
Oh gosh.
wait, how do we reframe, what's going on in this situation right now? And he was helping come up with reframes. I'm like, sir, thank you for this
Yeah,
chiropractic slash therapy session. Thank you.
right. Right. And because again, when we talk about terms, rejection is viewed as a negative light.
Yeah.
Especially when you're someone who likes to be in control, or when you're going through a transitional space. It's like, well, wait a minute, how can i how can I accept me if others aren't accepting of me in this space?
Yeah.
So even being able to again change the language and redefine certain terms, and that's a lot of the work that I do with my clients is like, okay, let's pick out some terms. What are some things that you're finding yourself saying a lot? And
Yeah.
even if you're not saying it, what are some things that are like coming up for you like consistently? And let's redefine those terms. So even when you were talking about, like reframing things, that can be difficult as well because we're talking about shifting the mindset and a whole lot of things can open up and happen when you're redefining a certain space. But I think it just goes back to that compassion piece like you were talking about earlier, being able to be in that space and be okay that you're in that space instead of trying to rush to get to the next thing.
Like taking sounds like such a cliche, but we are therapists. And I had a client one time ask me if we took a class and being cheesy, and I'm like, no, it's just inherently within us. But you're taking your power back, right, from the
Yeah.
negative connotation around those words and how we are kind of like attaching them to me.
Hmm.
Just and like, how do I take them off, see them, reframe them, and not even having to tell ourselves I have to release this or never have this thought again or not believe this about myself. Like that'd be great if we got there. Like let's be real, that would be amazing, right? If all of us
Yeah.
thought 100% positive thoughts about ourselves all the time.
Right. Right.
But like I feel like we would set people up to fail because we're humans in this very chaotic world. And it's like just being able to remind myself that I'm okay regardless. If I got rejected, I am still okay. And if we just get to that, like, I'll be okay place, it's gonna hurt and those things might come up again. But I'm really withholding myself a lot of other opportunities if I'm standing behind that narrative of that fear of the rejection.
Yeah, that was so good. That was so good. That is a lot of our work
Yes.
in what we get to teach and help clients navigate through.
And I wanted to ask and give you space real quick too before we wrap up here, but can you speak on like the unique experience and like the things you work on with your clients that are um, women or just people of color and minorities, and how their lens and that rejection, the fear of rejection, kind of the things that you target the most with them specifically? Because I come from a place of being a majority, where I'm cisgender, like white female in this world, and I don't have that lens, and I do my best to give those the space to shed light on that and that unique experience, and how you address that with those that you work with.
Oh yeah, and thank you for this space. I think too it goes back to a sense of belonging, and that is one of the specific things that I target in session. Even being able to unpack certain relationships and how that impacts our ability to be able to see ourselves, to just be us, and not have to code switch. I know that a lot of
Yeah.
minorities, including myself, growing up, and be very transparent here. Growing up, I always was told that I talk white. I heard that from like fourth grade up until. And so one of the things that I see, especially in minorities, either you're, especially if you're African American, you're either too black or you're not black enough for your environment or community. And again, that's one of the things that I try to teach, is that it's okay to be yourself and not feel that you have to kind of assimilate to this idea of what being quote unquote safe is. And that's something, these are conversations I have, with my friends and clients as well, is feeling the need to show up in a specific space to make other people feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And it goes down to even your skin color, the way you wear your hair. I know for me specifically, again, being fully transparent here, I always felt that I needed to show up looking a certain way and sounding a certain way or speaking a certain way to make other people comfortable,
Mhm.
and to really fit in. And so what I was running into is that, okay, I don't really like this space that I'm trying to fit into, but I'm not comfortable in the space that doesn't feel really accepting of me as well. So again, even working with individuals to create the mindset that you do belong and you can create this space for yourself that is not defined by society, by your environment, your background or anything. And the only person that should be made to feel safe is you, showing up as you and not feeling the need to change the way you talk, change the way you ask questions if you don't know certain things, or if you show up looking a certain way. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Just making sure you're showing up as your 100% authentic self. But again, going back into that rejection, certain things in environment are just taught that, okay, you have to look this way, you have to be this way to be accepted. And so now we're seeing a new generation of individuals that are accepting who they are. They are loving their skin color. They're loving the way they look. They're loving the way they speak, everything about themselves. And so it makes my heart so proud to see, because it took us a while I mean, and we're still getting there, to be honest. We're still getting there. But it makes my heart so glad to see individuals just showing up as their authentic selves and not trying to make other people comfortable so that they feel comfortable.
Right.
No, it's an internal thing.
I
So
think
yeah.
those on the other side of it, those that haven't addressed their own, inherent biases or racism or
Yeah.
homophobia, like all of those things, they are very much so reacting, and I feel like we're having this wave of like those on that side of things on the other side are trying to figure out how to word this. They're reacting because I feel like they don't know what to do with their discomfort because this wave of change is happening. Like it's happening.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
their generation,
Yeah.
they're making it happen. And I love it so much because I always say, I always want to do my best because I can walk into a space, right? I can walk into a space and I don't have to switch things on and off. And I have different privileges, but there's people out there that won't acknowledge those things and do their own work. And I'm not perfect by any means. Just because I'm a therapist, like that doesn't make me perfect, but I
Exactly.
take every single opportunity I can to say, what would it look like for me to be a better accomplice in this like wave that is going on? Because it's a very beautiful thing, and other people that haven't done that kind of work and don't, quite frankly, don't want to and don't care to, are very uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, because again, it goes right back to the narrative.
Yep.
What do we do?
Yep.
What do we do in this new space if if my character is changing
Mhm.
or the way that I show up is changing? So again, I encourage all of my clients, whether you're a woman of color, you're a member of the LGBTQIA community, just to own your space. And I think the wave that we're seeing right now is that we went from fighting for space to owning and creating our own spaces.
Mm.
And I think that's just such a beautiful thing to see, because again, it's not tied to being accepted. It's learning to accept yourself as you are.
And not to kind of come full circle, but realizing we're catching ourselves, like I'm rejecting myself before I ever even, show up in other spaces. Like I'm walking in there
Mhm.
in a state of self-rejection, or some people it's self-hate, and it's like if I could heal that for myself, I do, and I can step into the power that I do have, not to intentionally make people uncomfortable, but to take the space that I'm equally entitled to
Yes.
as everybody else.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming back. You're always welcome back, and you know that.
Thank you guys for having me.
And so, yeah, we ask everybody, and I feel like we've covered a lot of these little tidbits already in this episode. But did you have any um, last words, anything specifically like a mantra or any last tidbit that you want to leave our community with before we wrap up today?
Just something I share with my clients that I said earlier. The mantra is, I'm allowed to heal and hurt.
Mm,
That's something I
I
share with my
love that.
clients. So,
We can be healing and hurting at the same time.
hmm
Thank
yep.
you, thank you, thank you again. And do you have, I know, here's the place where, if there's anything, like any little plugs about yourself or where our community can find you, I think in our notes here, I have portcg.com, and then your Instagram, FaithWorks Coaching is your handle on Instagram, correct?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram. Once you click on my profile, the link to Port is in the bio. People are like, "How can I work with you?" And I'm like, "Click the link, click the link." So click the link. I am currently accepting clients, so I would definitely love to help any individual create a healing space.
And you're in Ohio, correct? Are you licensed
I
in
am
another state?
Georgia.
Georgia. Yes, we spoke to somebody else and they were in Ohio, but you're in Georgia. Only licensed in Georgia.
I'm in Georgia. I am licensed. I don't think I shared this last time.
That's
I don't
okay.
feel that I did, so I'm gonna plug it now.
Yeah.
I am licensed to do telemental health in Florida.
Okay.
So if there are any clients, listening, whether you're in Georgia or Florida, or whether you have friends in Florida that are looking for a great therapist, I'm your girl.
Yes, she is. Thank you again so much for your time and joining us again. Everybody, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow. You can sign up for notifications so you get notified when we release our new episodes. So make sure you sign up for those. And I think next week we have Mel Miles. She's going to be talking, it's kind of a very simple title for her topic, but she's going to be talking about her concept called soulcation, just a way of creating a life that you don't need a vacation from, basically. So she's going to share her framework and what things that realistically everybody that listens can implement in their day-to-day life to get that kind of feeling day to day. So again, thank you everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next time.